Heya, I'm Wen, and prioritizing is not my forte. I literally finished these slides 5 minutes ago because I was way more interested in setting up this extremely necessary green screen. And the same goes when it comes to concurrency. I'm really bad at checking whether the program I wrote is free from deadlocks, so ideally, I would like to use priorities to make a computer do that for me. Fortunately for me, that's what this talk is about. I'll be telling you about Priority GV, which is joint work with Ornella Darda from the University of Glasgow. Now, let me start off with a bit of an overview for those of you familiar with priorities alla Padovani and with Wadler's CP and GV. Priority GV is a session-type concurrent lambda calculus which completes the diagram you see here. It's a non-conservative extension of Wadler's GV, whereby non-conservative, I mean that from a proof theoretical perspective, we can prove more theorems about existing connectives, and it is related to Dardha and Gay's PCP via a pair of translations which enjoy operational correspondence. Although I should add here, only the translation from PCP to PGV is presented in the paper. Priority GV guarantees deadlock freedom via a priority effect alla Padovani, which tracks the start and end time of communication. For this presentation, we'll present the priority effect reflected into a graded monad M, which is graded by a pair of priorities which represent abstractly when communication starts and when it stops. In the paper, we present a type and effect system, though, which does not contain a monad at all. Instead, it assumes that every single term can perform communication effects. So essentially, everything lives in the monad. But here, we're extracting it into a monad because I think that it's a slightly neater presentation. Priority GV is a standard linear lambda calculus with sums and products, extended with this communication monad and with the appropriate monadic operations as well as communication and concurrency primitives. Before we go into details, let's look at an example program. So our example has 4 processes communicating in a ring. The bottom 3 processes are all adders, and they do the same thing. The only difference is that they're wired to different input and output channels. Let's just read over the leftmost one. It receives an integer over channel C, calls it x, adds 1 to x, and then sends that over channel D. The top process is the main process, which starts and ends the communication. It sends out the number 0 to the ring of adders, and after each of them have had their go, it receives the final value x and prints it. If you're confused about that squiggly operator, that's a monadic bind operation, and we'll get to that in a moment. But anyway, if we run this, it'll just print 3. It's a very complicated way of printing the number 3. Now, this example program should be well typed under our system because it is a sensible program and it does not deadlock. Now, let's investigate how. Let's start by talking about types. Priority GV has 3 bits that are important to typing. It has session types, priorities, and value types. First, let's get the value types out of the way, since they're pretty standard. Value types consist of all session types and the communication monad M, more on those later, and the standard linear functions, linear products, linear sums, the unit type, etc. I mean, feel free to add your favorite types, but these are all the ones we need. Okay, let's look at session types next. There's 3 session type constructors. There's send, there's receive, and there's end. And for this talk, we're not going to fuss too much over the end type. We'll treat channels of type end as both asynchronous and affine. In other words, as something that we can just forget about. In the paper, though, channels of type end are asynchronous and linear because that's what they were like in the original GV. And that means that they get to be annotated with priorities and have to be explicitly closed, upon which the 2 processes synchronize on the closing. But here, we just treat end channels as something we can forget about. Okay, so let's talk about the send type. Send has 3 arguments. It has a priority O, which represents the time at which the communication happens. Now, priorities are just natural numbers, and the lower the number is, the sooner it happens. And the second argument is a value type A, which is the type of the value being transmitted. And finally, a session type S, i.e., whatever it remains of the session or what we have to do after sending. Receive has the exact same three arguments. Not too surprising, send and receive are dual as you would expect. The send function takes a pair of arguments. It takes a value of type A and a channel over which an A should be sent. And it sends said value over said channel. It returns the session type for the remainder of the session. Sorry, it returns the channel for the remainder of the session. So you give it a channel and a thing to send over it, and it gives you back a new channel for the next action. The receive function takes a channel over which an A can be received and returns a pair, the value that it received, and again, the channel for the remainder of the session. Now, both the send and the receive are actions in the communication monad, which you can see from this M in the type. But more importantly, both are tagged with the priority O that we take from the channel type of their argument, the session type of their argument. And they return an action which starts and ends at time O. So both of these are actions that in the priority monad, in the communication monad, which say, I happen at exactly O. And using these bits and pieces, we can type part of our example. Specifically, we can type the individual actions. So if A is a channel over which you should receive an integer, then receive of A is a communication action which returns a pair of an integer and a closed channel. And if X is an integer and B is a channel over which we should send an integer, then send X plus 1 B is a communication action which returns a closed channel and sends X plus 1 over B. Right, so we've got these two individual bits. What about that stuff in the middle? What about that monadic bind? So it's time to look at the monad operations. First, let's look at the type. A monadic action has three indices. If we evaluate the action, then P is when communication starts, and Q is when it ends. We're grouping these together as a pair because together they make up the grading of the graded monad. But if you're unfamiliar with graded monads, just think of them as two separate parameters. And finally, A is the type of the thing that we're computing. Okay, so now let's look at the monad operations. A monad can be specified by two operations, bind and return. Bind is written as this squiggly thing, and return is written as return. Bind lets you sequence actions, where the second action gets to use the result of the first. So its first argument is an action which communicates between P1 and Q1 and computes an A. Its second argument is an action which uses that A to compute a B, and it communicates between P2 and Q2. And so if we combine these two, if we put them together, then we'll get a monadic action which starts communicating at either P1 or P2, whichever one is earlier, and it keeps on communicating until Q1 or Q2, whichever one is later. And it computes a B. Now, for everything to work out, we require that Q1 comes before P2, i.e., the first action must finish communicating before the second one starts. Right, so bind gives us a way to do sequential composition. What about return? Return embeds a pure computation, i.e., like a thing that doesn't perform any communication whatsoever. Now, we can't actually give concrete numbers for the priorities here, as there's no communication happening. So there's no start or stop times either. So what we do is we're using priority bounds, which we're defining at the top of the slides, as opposed to priorities. Now, priority bounds are either a concrete priority or top or bottom, with the expected ordering on top, bottom, and numbers. So a pure computation gets embedded into a communication action. Sorry, did I say communication? A pure computation gets embedded in a communication action with top and bottom, which means that it never starts communicating because it starts at top, and it's already finished because it's finished at bottom. So that altogether is the the communication monad. Okay, so if we use all of these pieces together, we can now type all of our other processes and probably also the main process. We'll take the bits from earlier, typing the individual actions, and we'll put them together using bind. Note that receive and send now have concrete priorities 0 and 1. And if we follow the derivation all the way down, that results in a monadic action that runs and communicates from 0 to 1. Okay, so what's still missing in our example? What haven't we typed yet? Like, it looks like we can type all our other processes in the main process, assuming suitable types for the print function. So what's still missing? Well, what about these boxes and these arrows? Processes, right, these boxes, each of these boxes represents a thread, and each of these arrows represents a communication channel, and we don't have ways to construct those yet. So let's add that. So we're adding two new monadic operations, fork and new. Fork takes the communication action and spawns it off into its own process. So for instance, for our example, we'd have 3 forks, 1 for each child process. The top box is our main process, so we don't actually have to fork to create it. Now, note that the argument of fork, the action, starts off with labels P and Q, but it ends off with top and bottom. So it ends up looking somewhat even like a pure action. And that's a thing known as effect masking, essentially by throwing away this information where we make sure that we only ever demand sequentiality of things that actually happen, in sequence. Hi, this is Future Win, and I'm here to tell you there's a small bug in this typing of fork. See, it shouldn't be allowed to mask the starting time, only the ending time. Which makes sense. Fork runs in parallel from the moment the fork instruction is evaluated, so the ending time doesn't matter, but the starting time sure does. So let's just fix that right there. Great, let's carry on. New creates a new communication channel with 2 endpoints, one endpoint of type S and one endpoint of the dual type of S. So for instance, for our example here, we have 4 calls to new, and one for each of the channels. And each of those calls creates 2 endpoints, one for each side of the arrow. Now, creating channels doesn't do any communication, so it's an action again labeled with top and bottom that seems pure, is pure. Now the call to new returns one endpoint of type S and one of the dual type. And duality is standard. Send is dual to receive and end is self-dual. So for our example, probably we would call new with the type S being send 0 int and then end. And then the second component would be receive 0 int end. However, note that 2 dual actions need to share the same priority. So this is what creates the links between the different priorities across threads. And that's priority GV. If you want to type an effect system for this, just imagine that everything lives in the concurrency monad and insert finds as needed. Right. Thank you for your attention. Priority GV that I've presented is the session types concurrent lambda calculus, which completes the following diagram, and it guarantees deadlock freedom via a priority effect by tracking start and end times of communications in a graded monad. Thank you very much.